Hello and welcome to the Short Story Workshop. In each episode, we read a short story and then discuss it. I'm Mel, I'm here with Matt and Simone, and this week's story is Moonface by Jack London. I picked this story. The reason I picked it is because I read it and then I got really into what was going to happen. Like, what was he going to do to this guy who he really hated for no reason? I liked both the characters. It sounds weird, but I kind of liked the guy he hated, and I kind of liked the narrator as well because he hated him so much and was so dedicated to his hate. And when his plan kind of came to its end, I was just like, well, that was brilliant. I don't know, this was amazing and hilarious and terrible, and yeah, I really liked the story. So I hope that in that rambling you can understand the joy I felt when I read the story. So here is Moonface by Jack London.
John Claverhouse was a moon-faced man. You know the kind, cheekbones wide apart, chin and forehead melting into the cheeks to complete the perfect round, and the nose, broad and pudgy, equidistant from the circumference, flattened against the very centre of the face like a dough ball upon the ceiling. Perhaps that is why I hated him. For truly he had become an offence to my eyes, and I believed the earth to be cumbered with his presence. Perhaps my mother may have been superstitious of the moon, and looked upon it over the wrong shoulder at the wrong time. Be that as it may, I hated John Claverhouse. Not that he had done me what society would consider a wrong or an ill turn, far from it. The evil was of a deeper, subtler sort, so elusive, so intangible as to defy clear, definite analysis in words. We all experience such things at some period in our lives. For the first time we see a certain individual, one who the very instant before we did not dream existed, and yet, at the first moment of meeting, we say, I do not like that man. Why do we not like him? We do not know why. We know only that we do not. We have taken a dislike, that is all. And so I with John Claverhouse. What right had such a man to be happy? Yet he was an optimist. He was always gleeful and laughing. All things were always all right. Curse him! How it grated on my soul that he should be so happy. Other men could laugh and it did not bother me. I even used to laugh myself before I met John Claverhouse. But his laugh, it irritated me, maddened me, as nothing else under the sun could irritate or madden me. It haunted me, gripped hold of me, and would not let me go. It was a huge, gargantuan laugh. Waking or sleeping, it was always with me, whirring and jarring across my heartstrings like an enormous rasp. At break of day it came whooping across the fields to spoil my pleasant morning reverie. Under the aching noonday glare, when the green things drooped and the birds withdrew to the depths of the forest, and all nature drowsed, his great ha ha and ho ho rose up to the sky and challenged the sun. And at black midnight, from the lonely crossroads where he turned from town into his own place, came his plaguey cachinnations to rouse me from my sleep and make me writhe and clench my nails into my palms. I went forth privily in the night time and turned his cattle into his fields, and in the morning heard his whooping laugh as he drove them out again. It is nothing, he said. The poor dumb beasties are not to be blamed for straying into fatter pastures. He had a dog he called Mars, a big, splendid brute, part deerhound and part bloodhound, and resembling both. Mars was a great delight to him, and they were always together. But I bided my time, and one day, when opportunity was ripe, lured the animal away and settled for him with strychnine and beefsteak. It made positively no impression on John Claverhouse. His laugh was as hearty and frequent as ever, and his face as much like the full moon as it always had been. Then I set fire to his haystacks and his barn. But the next morning, being Sunday, he went forth blithe and cheerful. Where are you going? I asked him as he went by the crossroads. Trout, he said, and his face beamed like a full moon. I just dote on trout. Was there ever such an impossible man? His whole harvest had gone up in his haystacks and barn. It was uninsured, I knew, and yet, in the face of famine and the rigorous winter, he went out gaily in quest of a mess of trout, forsooth, because he doted on them. Had gloom but rested, no matter how lightly on his brow, or had his bovine countenance grown long and serious, and less like the moon, Or had he removed that smile but once from off his face, I am sure I could have forgiven him for existing. But no, he grew only more cheerful under misfortune. I insulted him. He looked at me in slow and smiling surprise. I fight you? Why? He asked slowly, and then he laughed. You are so funny. Oh, you'll be the death of me. Oh. What would you? It was past endurance. By the blood of Judas, how I hated him. Then there was that name, Claverhouse. What a name. Wasn't it absurd? Claverhouse. Merciful heaven, why Claverhouse? Again and again, I asked myself that question. I should not have minded Smith or Brown or Jones, but Claverhouse? I leave it to you. Repeat it to yourself. Claverhouse. Just listen to the ridiculous sound of it. Claverhouse. Should a man live with such a name, I ask of you? No, you say, and no, said I. But I bethought me of his mortgage. What of his crops and barn destroyed? I knew he'd be unable to meet it. So I got a shrewd, close-mouthed, tight-fisted moneylender to get the mortgage transferred to him. I did not appear, but through this agent I forced the foreclosure, and but few days, no more, believe me, than the law allowed, were given John Claverhouse to remove his goods and chattels from the premises. Then I strolled down to see how he took it, for he had lived there upward of 20 years, but he met me with his saucer eyes twinkling, and the light glowing and spreading in his face till it was as a full-risen moon. Ha ha ha! He laughed. The funniest tyke, that youngster of mine, did you ever hear the like? Let me tell you, he was down, playing by the edge of the river, when a piece of the bank caved in and splashed him. Oh, Papa, he cried, a great big puddle flew up and hit me. He stopped and waited for me to join him in his infernal glee. I don't see any laugh in it, I said shortly, and I know my face went sour. He regarded me with wonderment, and then came the damnable light, glowing and spreading as I have described it, till his face shone, soft and warm, like the summer moon, and then the laugh. Ha ha! That's funny, you don't see it, eh? Oh, he doesn't see it. Why, look here, you know, a puddle. But I turned on my heel and left him. That was the last. I could stand it no longer. The thing must end right there, I thought. Curse him. The earth should be quit of him. And as I went over the hill, I could hear his monstrous laugh reverberating against the sky. Now, I pride myself on doing things neatly, and when I resolved to kill John Claverhouse, I had it in mind to do so in such fashion that I should not look back upon it and feel ashamed. I hate bungling, and I hate brutality. To me there is something repugnant in merely striking a man with one's naked fist. Oh, it is sickening. So to shoot, or stab, or club John Claverhouse, oh, that name, did not appeal to me. And not only was I impelled to do it neatly and artistically, but also in such manner that not the slightest possible suspicion could be directed against me. To this end I bent my intellect, and after a week of profound incubation, I hatched the scheme. Then I set to work. I bought a water spaniel bitch, 5 months old, and devoted my whole attention to her training. Had anyone spied upon me, they would have remarked that this training consisted entirely of one thing: retrieving. I taught the dog, which I called Bologna, to fetch sticks I threw into the water, and not only to fetch, but to fetch at once, without mouthing or playing with them. The point was that she was to stop for nothing, but to deliver the stick in all haste. I made a practice of running away and leaving her to chase me with the stick in her mouth till she caught me. She was a bright animal, and took to the game with such eagerness that I was soon content. After that, at the first casual opportunity, I presented Bologna to John Claverhouse. I knew what I was about, for I was aware of a little weakness of his, and of a little private sinning of which he was regularly and inveterately guilty. No, he said, when I placed the end of the rope in his hand. No, you don't mean it. And his mouth opened wide, and he grinned all over his damnable moon face. I kind of thought somehow you didn't like me, he explained. Wasn't it funny for me to make such a mistake? And at the thought he held his sides with laughter. What is her name? He managed to ask between paroxysms. Bologna, I said. He tittered. What a funny name. I gritted my teeth, for his mirth put them on edge, and snapped out between them, "She was the wife of Mars, you know." Then the light of the full moon began to suffuse his face, until he exploded with, "That was my other dog! Well, I guess she's a widow now." He whooped after me, and I turned and fled swiftly over the hill. The week passed by, and on Saturday evening I said to him, "You go away Monday, don't you?" He nodded his head and grinned. "Then you won't have another chance to get a mess of those trout you just dote on." But he did not notice the sneer. "Oh, I don't know," he chuckled. "I'm going up tomorrow to try pretty hard." Thus was assurance made doubly sure, and I went back to my house, hugging myself with rapture. Early next morning, I saw him go by with a dip net and gunny sack, and Bellona trotting at his heels. I knew where he was bound, and cut out by the back pasture and climbed through the underbrush to the top of the mountain. Keeping carefully out of sight, I followed the crest along for a couple of miles to a natural amphitheatre in the hills, where the little river raced down out of a gorge and stopped for breath in a large and placid rock-bound pool. That was the spot. I sat down on the croup of the mountain, where I could see all that occurred, and lighted my pipe. Ere many minutes had passed, John Claverhouse came plodding up the bed of the stream. Bellona was ambling about him, and they were in high feather, her short, snappy barks mingling with his deeper chest notes. Arriving at the pool, he threw down the dip net and sack, and drew from his hip pocket what looked like a large fat candle. But I knew it to be a stick of giant, for such was his method of catching trout. He dynamited them. He attached the fuse by wrapping the giant tightly in a piece of cotton. Then he ignited the fuse and tossed the explosive into the pool. Like a flash, Bellona was into the pool after it. I could have shrieked aloud for joy. Claverhouse yelled at her, but without avail. He pelted her with clods and rocks, but she swam steadily on till she got the stick of giant in her mouth, when she whirled about and headed for shore. Then, for the first time, he realized his danger and started to run. As foreseen and planned by me, she made the bank and took out after him. Oh, I tell you, it was great! As I have said, the pool lay in a sort of amphitheatre. Above and below, the stream could be crossed on stepping stones, and around, up and down and across the stones raced Claverhouse and Bellona. I could never have believed that such an ungainly man could run so fast, but run he did, Bellona hot-footed after him and gaining. And then, just as she caught up, he in full stride, and she leaping with nose at his knee, there was a sudden flash, a burst of smoke, a terrific detonation, and where man and dog had been the instant before, there was naught to be seen but a big hole in the ground. Death from accident while engaged in illegal fishing. That was the verdict of the coroner's jury, and that is why I pride myself on the neat and artistic way in which I finished off John Claverhouse. There was no bungling, no brutality, nothing of which to be ashamed in the whole transaction, as I am sure you will agree. No more does his infernal laugh go echoing among the hills, and no more does his fat moon face rise up to vex me. My days are peaceful now, and my night's sleep deep. I think it's great, honestly, for a lot of the reasons that you said in the intro. The characters are endearing in a very strange kind of way. Like, they're both a bit weird, which I think just makes them more interesting, honestly. And it's so intriguing about what's going to happen, and it delivers on everything it promises. Like, what else? What's there not to love?
I did not find the characters endearing, but I did enjoy the story. Well, I found Moonface endearing. The protagonist was mean.
The protagonist
He
is
is
definitely mean.
I won't dispute that one.
I know. Irrational hatred makes something in me twitch. I find it harder to root for that kind of villain, personally.
But it's kind of funny just because how irrational it is. Like, it doesn't make any sense. He doesn't have any good reason to hate this guy, and yet I can kind of see what he means. I can see how someone like Moonface would be really irritating.
So you'd kill him too, I see. This happy person who's just, like, done nothing to you. God, how dare they be happy?
I think...
How dare they be happy and not conventionally attractive?
Like the reticence of Lady Anne, this story is a relatable emotion taken to a logical extreme.
Feel like that part at the beginning where he's explaining his irrational hatred is something that I could relate to, because sometimes this doesn't happen to me very often and I would never actually hurt anybody, but sometimes I do meet someone and I just think, I don't know what it is about you, but I don't like you.
Sometimes there's like anti-resonance, right?
Yeah.
Like you just don't click for whatever reason.
And it's really difficult to define what it is. I like to think that I can get on with most people, but there are still occasionally some people I come across and I'm like, I'm going to get as far away from you as possible because I don't want to deal with you. And so I found that aspect of him relatable, even though I wouldn't actually come up with a bizarre plot to kill anybody using a trained dog and a bit of TNT. Not my style, really.
It was a delightfully unexpected murder plan.
It was, yes.
You kind of can sense that the situation is going to deteriorate, but you don't know that it's going to end up the way it does, because it just is so... Who would ever think of that?
I love as well that they just give you the part where he's training the dog to fetch the stick, and you're like, what on earth is he doing? How is this going to help in any way?
Yeah, I thought he was gonna, like, I don't know, have the guy dragged into the river or something by the dog. I'm like, but surely he'd just let go of the lead, was a thought I had before I got to the actual plan.
Yeah, it doesn't, like, when you first read that, you're like, well, how is a dog playing fetch? You know, that's quite cute. It's not really going to make anything bad happen, surely.
He says, I'm going to kill him, and I'm going to kill him by teaching this dog to play fetch. I mean, it's a great hook. It doesn't make any sense. You want to know how that's going to work.
It's true.
It's fun.
It's relatable. You know, if there's someone who's just happy all the time and so unshakably happy, like Mr. Claverhouse here, I think it is kind of irritating, because we spend a lot of time trying to be, you know, not get too depressed and try and look on the bright side of things. If someone can just do that like instantly without trying, it's almost like, damn you and your constant upbeat attitude. Do you know what I mean?
I think so. I guess he's just one of life's optimists, Claverhouse. He just, oh well, my harvest is up in flames. It's fine. He just takes things as they happen, and I sense that the protagonist wants him to be upset, and he's doing whatever he can to upset him, and it just isn't working. And he's getting frustrated, and it's like building this hatred up and up and up until the end. It's a very interesting arc.
But do you see what I mean? That like, it's kind of admirable that he's so upbeat all the time, and yet it's equally kind of easy to resent him for it.
Do you mean in the sense that you feel like your life is going a bit terrible and you've got that person who's always so happy and you're like, damn, why can't I be you?
It does make it worse. Like if you're having that's true. If you're having a rough time and there's someone who's all just talking about how lovely the sun is today or something, like, it's just annoying.
Yeah, I can kind of get that. It would be nice to know some more about the narrator to really get that, though, because he doesn't really say much about his own life, just that he really hates this guy.
I mean, he's clearly got some screws loose.
I mean, he keeps going back to the fact he's Moonface, doesn't he? Like, something about his looks seems to kind of be what's causing the reaction, or at least that's how I read it.
I don't know, because he does talk about his looks quite a lot near the start, but then he latches onto lots of other weird things, like his name.
His laugh.
I think it's just he wants to hate this person, so he's like finding ways to rationalize it by saying, oh, it's because his name is really stupid, or it's because of his face. And he's like, it's always like he's trying to like justify it somehow. That's how I felt.
Yeah.
That's kind of true to how I feel in real life when I don't like someone. I'm like, why don't I like you? What is it about you that I just don't like? Because usually I like people, but I don't like you, and I don't know why, and it really bothers me. Sometimes the not knowing is the bit that bothers you more than the actual person.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's really well written, actually. Now I think about that, I'm a fan. More than I was already.
Yeah, I think that's really smart how the kind of like two different viewpoints are built into the story, and they're so different. And yet, just in this short story, I can kind of understand both of them. I think that's really smart.
It does have a good character balance. And it's quite a good slide as well into the kind of protagonist changing mindset. Because it starts off almost reasonable, or at least relatable, and then just keeps edging up and you're like, what? He set fire to his house?
It's classic escalation, isn't it?
Yeah, he keeps upping it, going, oh, now you're going to be upset. Oh, now you're going to be upset. No, you still seem to be happy. Okay.
The more short stories I read, the more I think that the escalation is just maybe the best structure. Like, it always works really well.
Yeah, it is a good one to use because you can use it in so many different ways for so many different genres, for so many different scenarios.
There's an inbuilt sense of progress because you're building towards something, and there's a good hook as well. So you're like, how far is this going to go? Where is this going? And I feel like that structure gives you so much just free almost just by arranging your story in this way.
Yeah, I always love stories that have a sense of progression. There's a reason people are into character arcs and things. It's because we like to see them progress.
Yeah, I think it's necessary. It's often very frustrating to read a story that just feels like it's standing still.
Yeah.
I will admit I have limited patience for stories that move very slowly. I would prefer they get to the point a bit quicker. But yeah, this is good. This goes straight to, like, it's very neatly written. All right, so should we talk about, like, did you find the story funny?
Like, come on, it's funny.
Just gonna say that I wasn't sure until that image at the end where he talks about there being a crater where there was once a man and a dog, and I was just like,
I didn't want to find it funny.
It's terrible.
I felt very guilty for finding it funny.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. And yeah,
I think that just makes it funnier though, right? Like, the easiest way to make someone laugh is sometimes to tell them not to.
I don't know why that last bit just tickled me so much, because I was kind of like, well, the descriptions, I guess, of Cloverhouse are kind of funny in that, the way he talks and his mannerisms, the laughing and things, something about the way he phrased the trout stuff was kind of entertaining on its own. But then you get to the end and you just imagine that dog just chasing him. It's just, why is it so funny?
Did you think that some of the things the narrator said were quite funny earlier in the story as well, like the random things he latches onto? Like, just the extent of his hatred was quite funny to me.
The bit where he starts going, oh, I can't believe he's got such a stupid name. Even his name annoys me. I'm just there like,
yeah,
okay, you need to chill, but
it's funny.
It was, but then there was also like this, at least I felt like this kind of undercurrent of uneasiness with it as well. Just because like he was so hateful that it just immediately partly made me recoil and partly made me want to laugh.
Yeah, it's
really viscerally reaction to him and like how much he didn't like this guy who hadn't done anything to him. Like, I guess because he's like Moonface is kind of coded a bit not neurotypical, but like it's almost that kind of latching onto someone because they're a bit odd kind of thing. I don't know, something about it just made me really uneasy, but while it was also funny.
that might be why he doesn't like him. But I don't know. It's hard to tell because he comes up with all these stupid reasons why he doesn't like him. It's like, oh, we don't know what the truth is. We only see Moonface through his eyes as well. It makes it a bit more difficult.
I think it is just his unending optimism. It's almost like he's trying to make Moonface be upset about something because then it will be okay. It's like maybe if he'd burned his barn and he'd cried about it, he would have moved on and would have been able to forgive it. It's like his unending optimism just spurs him on until he reaches a point of murder.
This is interesting because it reads like he's a bully, and Moonface does exactly what you're supposed to do when someone is bullying you. You just kind of laugh it off and ignore them because then they'll get bored and they'll stop. And this guy doesn't stop.
I think it's just because his motivation is so strange.
But yeah, I do understand. That's why I kind of asked the question, because I was like, I'm laughing. Why am I laughing? Is it okay I'm laughing? I don't think I should be laughing. Or maybe I should be laughing. I'm not sure. So I wanted to check you guys and see what you thought, because I'm like, this is horrible. This man has just been murdered. And yet, the situation by which he's been murdered is so comical that I'm sniggering here, even though obviously in real life I would never want this to happen to anybody ever. And I never would condone hurting someone just because you have an irrational hatred of them. In this story, it's
or
funny.
Blowing up dogs.
Yeah, don't want to blow up dogs.
And yet you got to look at the story. It just has such a sense of this is terrible, but also it's so funny. Like, just be
And the
honest.
bit where the character is like, see, it was clean and no mess. It just seemed to add to the humor to me. I was like, well, he's right.
He was so satisfied.
Yeah.
You know? It's like watching someone fall over. You're like, I probably shouldn't be laughing. I hope they're okay. But also, it was funny.
I had that when I fell over on the ice. Lots of people were like, "Lol, Mel fell over on the ice," and other people were like, "Oh my god, are you okay?" And I'm like, "No, actually, it really hurts." But also, I appreciate it probably looked quite funny, so it's okay. Okay, so what did you think of Moonface then? So John Claverhouse. Did you like him?
Claverhouse, is that how we say it?
Claverhouse. I don't know. I'm not sure how you're supposed to say it.
I think he's great. I wish there were more of him, honestly. It's funny. I like him. Like, everything I aspire to be is within this man. He's so zen. He just gets on with things. Doesn't get depressed. He's like, that's just life, man. It's so chill. I love it.
Yeah, I like him a lot as well, which is why I feel especially bad that his death was funny to me, because I like that this man is nice. He would be exactly the kind of coworker you'd want to be with, because no matter how bad things get, he just carries on and he thinks it's absolutely fine. And I guess you could kind of say he's a bit callous when he's laughing about his kid falling down the riverbank or something. But I assume that everything was fine and the kid was okay and he's just seeing the funny side of it.
I mean, I do understand why it would be irritating. Especially, he has such a distinctive laugh, right? To hear that constantly, maybe eventually it would grate on you.
But then there is also the slight implication in the text that it is kind of like a persona or a mask. There's that bit where his face kind of flickers like he's almost going to kind of show something, and then he kind of bolsters up. So it makes you wonder if he'd even be acting so optimistic if, like, the protagonist wasn't being such an utter douche.
You think he's putting it on just for the narrator?
Partially, yeah. I find that almost funnier. Or, like, I could definitely see that reading. Like, kill him with kindness kind of thing.
So you think it's malicious?
Not necessarily malicious, but, like, or a coping mechanism or something.
I thought maybe it was like, oh, this guy, he seems like he's having a pretty rough time. He's not very happy, so I should try and cheer him up by being really happy all the time. Is that what's happening here?
Maybe, or it's just like, you know, sometimes really sad people are like the jokers, aren't they? Like, laugh or you're gonna cry.
And there is that part where he kind of goes, well, I thought you didn't like me.
Yeah.
Suggesting he knows that something is up.
Yeah, like there's just something so exquisitely painful about that to me. About that moment, because it's just so mean. Like, I don't know. He's just so oblivious to it that it's like hitting a puppy or something, which the protagonist clearly has no problems with.
Right, yeah, that's true.
Yes, I am sorry for Moonface. He didn't deserve to die.
He did not. He was a good egg.
Exactly. Alright, so I guess one of the strengths of this story is I'm going to say villain protagonist, I think, and the way his POV is used to explain all these horrible things he's doing to Moonface. I think it works, especially because of that passage we were talking about earlier, which is more relatable because we will meet people sometimes we don't like and we don't really know why. So how would you write a villain protagonist if it were you? Do you have any ideas or tips on how you would go about it, or maybe what works in this story for you?
You need to do what you always do when you're writing your POV character, which is make it so the reader likes hearing their thoughts, I guess is maybe one way to put it. And you can even if they're a villain, you can make them pleasant to be around, if you know what I mean. You can make them funny, which makes us like them a bit more. You can make it so their actions are kind of understandable, even if we wouldn't maybe go as far as the villains do. And things like this, like there are so many different ways to make your characters relatable or endearing. I like one of my favorite villains is Mr. Mercedes from the Stephen King novel of that name, and like he's very messed up. Like he opens a book by murdering a whole group of people, but he's also kind of funny and very smart, and there are good things about him, and he's just fun to read about. So even though he's definitely really dark and does some really, like, probably the worst things a character could do in fiction, it's really intriguing, and every line he says, like when he's on the page, is really dynamic and interesting because it's often funny and smart and clever and just not really the way people think. So you can still have like fascinating and interesting characters even if they're villains. I don't even think the villainous like holds you back very much. I think we're more forgiving of the moral compass of our characters than we like to think we are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I suppose my worry with writing that kind of character is making them go too far and losing the reader.
Yeah, you can, but it's kind of a balancing act, right? Because if we can forgive them an equal amount, like proportional to how much we like them, I suppose. So if your character starts doing some really bad things, then we need to understand them more, and they need to be funnier, and all these other things. Like you just need to balance it properly.
I think there's also something to be said about deliberately overstepping the reader's bounds after making your villain really charismatic and almost having the reader or protagonist kind of root for them throughout, and then suddenly pulling the switch and making it clear that actually no, they are a villain. Because I find it can be quite interesting in making your reader question their assumptions. But yeah, typically, as long as you've got something appealing about your villain, people are going to be interested in them, or if they've got an understandable value or motivation. The other thing I like doing is having them be a foil to the protagonist. I find that interesting.
Yes.
I love a character dynamic.
So if you were writing a villain protagonist, would you then put a hero in as the foil, a bit like I suppose Moonface is in this story?
Yeah, I would, yeah. I'd always have like a kind of protagonist
super
foil.
fun.
We get this a lot in like anti-hero stories. I'm trying to think of a good example. I'm sure I've seen this.
Lawless hero kind of character with a really lawful character. That's one that you see a lot.
Yeah.
I can only think of really obscure examples, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's kind of the problem I'm having.
I need to just read more books with villain protagonists, clearly.
Mortal Engines kind of does this because Hester is very violent and morally not really. I mean, let's put it this way: Hester is a relatable character and a good one, but often does some morally grey things, or maybe just I should have just murders people. That does happen sometimes. And then the villain in the first book, Valentine, is generally portrayed as a great guy who everyone likes and does great things.
That's a good example. That's Mortal Engines by Philip Reeve, isn't it?
That's the one.
Yeah.
Not the film, though, because the film ruined the villain's character, in my opinion. Just made him a villain, which was not the point.
Yeah, I quite enjoyed the film, but I haven't read the book. I'm sure the book is better.
I think it also depends what you want out of your villain character, because sometimes you want them to be kind of like the gentleman rogue, kind of likable villain. Like they're terrible, but like dazzling. Like I don't know, like your Moriartys, your that kind of villain, where they're like megalomaniac. Not megalomaniac bastards as they often are, but like the master chess player kind of character, who are meant to be like charming, seduce you to the dark side villain. And then you kind of get the villain or like narrators like Humbert Humbert from Lolita, for example, or Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, where they're trying to do something slightly different, I think, with the character, where it's more about like getting into these kinds of unusual mindsets, for example.
That's like the car crash ideology, right? Like this character is terrible, but it's fascinating and I can't look away. That's kind of the feeling I got from Gone Girl sometimes.
The villain in that has such style compared to like when you see more, I guess, more realistic villains as well are more likely to draw a line, because when they're fantastical, then we're less like, mentally connected to, say, for example, a villain who's doing things that relate closely to what we've seen in like real life. The grittier your villain, I think the harder it is you're gonna have to sell to have them as a really likable protagonist character. But then, arguably, the more you make your villain a protagonist, the harder it is to completely see them as kind of monstrous, because by virtue of making them a protagonist, they can't be opaque to the reader, which is what happened with Hannibal Lecter as a character, where he started very much as the unknowable monster character and kind of got more and more protagonist-like throughout his incarnations for years.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess that makes sense, because if you're in that point of view, well, the idea of stories is to have you root for the protagonist. Difficult to root for them if they're an out-and-out villain who's always like blowing up dogs or whatever. All right. Do we want to talk any more about the ending, or do you feel like we've covered that? So the ending where he gets away with murdering poor old Moonface.
Can we talk about the very last line a little more? Because I find it really interesting that the narrator says, "My days are peaceful now and my nights sleep deep." It's like he has no remorse whatsoever.
Yeah, that's actually quite chilling when I think about it.
Kind of reminded me of that if the guy from Poe's Telltale Heart had got away with it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's quite similar to that story in quite a lot of ways, I suppose. Just murdering someone because you don't like something about them.
Yeah, like that's what the story reminded me of while I was reading it. That story.
He has no consequences, whereas in the Telltale Heart, he does.
Yeah. Also, it's very like overtly implied that the narrator in the Telltale Heart is mentally unstable. Whereas I almost prefer this one where it's like implied that he's kind of nutso because of the things that he does, but most of the things he says sound perfectly sane. Like, he doesn't sound like he's losing his mind, it's just the things that he's saying, right? You know what I mean?
I don't know, some of the things he does are a bit crazy. I suppose the way he's telling the story doesn't sound like he's crazy.
I guess to me it's more powerful that his craziness is demonstrated by his actions rather than the way that he tells the story. I think that works
Oh,
better.
I see what you mean. Yes, that makes sense.
I think I also just prefer my villains clever or like, with at least some veneer of sanity. Just because I don't know, there's something, maybe just because there's something so sad about like villains who are just so completely crazy, or like because it's harder to hold them accountable as characters, or I don't know, maybe just because like whatever, I'm aware of the stigma against mentally ill people and villainy. So I don't know what it is, but I just prefer my villains sane.
They have maybe more purposeful ways of doing things.
Feels like you have to come up with a more interesting idea than, oh, well, they're just crazy, because you don't want to examine what you're doing in your writing.
Yeah, it kind of, if you say they're mentally unstable, it kind of builds a wall between them and the reader, right? There's something in there that we can't understand. It distances you from it.
Yeah. A stronger villain is the one that you can understand.
I also find it interesting that he's almost like, to me, at the very end, the narrator is almost implying that he's done the world a service by doing this. Did you get that impression?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's definitely thinks that he's done this for everybody. Like, he thinks that he's made everything better by getting rid of Moonface. And I don't know.
It's so interesting. It really underlines that sentiment that everyone's the hero of their own story. Like, he actually just thinks he's the good guy.
Yeah. It's like, he's so annoying. I hated his laugh. The world would be better off without it. Crazy stuff. But yeah, it's interesting.
I love that. I think that's almost like the last notch in the escalation, is that not only does he do this, but he feels good about it.
Yeah.
And he gets away with it as well.
Yeah.
I think it's rare to find stories where the villain 100% gets away with stuff.
It's more common in villain protagonist stories, just because.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Or with anything where the character is a serial killer, for example, because the very definition of a serial killer requires you to get away with it. At least once. Or twice, I believe.
All right. Does anybody have anything further they'd like to talk about with this story?
Did anyone else get the reference with the whole dog's name? I don't know if it was planned or not.
What was this?
Is this the bit where he says that Bellona is Mars' wife?
Yeah, there's that, but she's also the ancient Roman goddess of war, which just amused me. There's a little detail.
Oh, no, I didn't know that.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's a cool detail.
It's really good.
Mars being the
god of war.
The god of war.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Oh, I like that. Yeah. All right, so the story was written by Jack London. He was one of the first celebrity writers who became kind of known globally for his work. He wrote both short stories and novels in lots of different genres. He wrote some sci-fi, he wrote some kind of ghost stories, he wrote some stories about boxing and other things, and lots about animals. I would love to do an episode on this other story I read by him called The Shadow and the Flash, which is about two rivals trying to invent a substance that makes somebody invisible, and they both go about it in opposite ways.
Okay, yeah, we're gonna need to read that.
It sounds great.
It's good. The only thing that made me pause was the ending, but I think if I read it again, it might make more sense. But yeah, it was a really fun story because one of them tries to make themselves transparent and the other tries to make themselves, like, they describe it as like a kind of black that is so dark that nobody else can see it. I was like, I think the science is kind of dodgy here, but
that's just wrong. But okay.
I appreciate the sentiment, so I think we should look at that story at one point, and it's really good. So if anybody's interested in reading it beforehand, it's called The Shadow and the Flash. His short stories receive very good reviews, with critics saying, oh, below 7,500 words, Jack London is amazing and a genius, and nothing can beat his short stories. His novels, however, gained very mixed reviews, including from Ambrose Bierce, who we talked about last week. He said of the novel The Seawolf, the love element, with its absurd suppressions and impossible proprieties, is awful. So, not even hanging around, just straight in awful.
Gosh.
I get the impression that people didn't mess around as much back in the day. There's a lot of tiptoeing these days, isn't it? You wouldn't tweet that someone's novel is awful if you personally knew them.
Oh,
right?
Definitely not. No, you just don't do that. Someone's put their heart and soul into this thing. You don't just come out and be like, it's awful. Something I thought was interesting is that it said his novels were structured more with short stories, because that's where his strength lay. And this kind of made me think about my own kind of stance on writing novels, and maybe I should try not to write awful novels, obviously, but maybe I could take the Jack London approach and try and break them up into smaller short stories that are more episodic. His most famous book is Call of the Wild, which probably the ancestor of many novels now that have animal protagonists. So some modern examples that I've read are The Animals of Farthingwood, which is all about animals trying to escape a forest and get to a nature reserve. Lots of them die, and it's pretty serious for a children's book, but I super enjoyed it. And Warrior Cats, which is one of those ones where occasionally you read something about the Warrior Cats fandom and it's just completely mad. And I think there's about 100 of those books out now. So
Really?
What?
Yeah, I think Warrior Cats, because it's written by so the pseudonym is Erin Hunter, but it's actually a bunch of different writers all working together. So they're known as the Erins by the fan. I only know this because I read lots of hobby drama threads on Reddit, and when it's about warrior cats, they're always so interesting.
I remember reading a few of those books.
Wow.
Yeah, I read the first one and actually quite enjoyed it. It was actually similar to Call of the Wild because it's about a house cat who then he leaves his domesticated life and goes out to live with all these wild cats, which is similar to Call of the Wild, in that it's about a dog who goes from being like a sort of housebound tame dog out into as the title says, into the wild. It's told from the POV of the dog, kind of like Warrior Cats is from the POV of the cats. The other thing about Call of the Wild is it has never been out of print since 1903. This book has been available to buy. It's never gone. They've never stopped printing it, and I just think that's amazing.
That is a long time.
A long time. It's over 100 years.
120 years? Come on.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. I especially like the link with stuff like Warrior Cats, where you're like, hang on, that's the same story, essentially. And I'm sure that plotline is used in a lot of other animal stories as well. But I just thought it was very interesting because I'd read a lot of those kind of books when I was a kid. I used to love them. Probably if I read The Farthingwood now, I'd still enjoy it. The only reason I picked it out of the library to read was because when you were a kid, obviously you'd pick the biggest book in the library, and that was the biggest book in the library.
I know the feeling.
Yeah. Bro would be like, whoa, Mel, you really read that book? Heck yeah, I read it.
Man.
Anyway, so there's a brief look at Jack London.
I should read more of his stories.
Should. He's written over 100, and there are definitely some good ones. I read quite a few of them to try and find one for the podcast, and settled on this one as being the one that I liked the most. But we'll definitely do The Shadow and the Flash, I think.
Sure. Yeah, I really enjoyed this one.
Good. Thank you for listening. Please leave a comment on our website, shortstoryworkshop.com, to let us know what you thought. You can also find all our previous short stories and episodes. We'll be back with another story next week.
No, we won't. It's 2 weeks, Mel.
We'll be back with another story in 2 weeks. Bye.